around job retention scheme, redundancies, and that started to give us some ideas about what we wanted to talk about today. Then, of course, Chancellor, as he always seems to do, came up with an announcement on a Friday, changes to the job retention scheme, and that really set the tone for what we wanted to talk about today. So we do want this to be a bit of a conversation, obviously not free for all because we've got a lot of people in the meeting today. But what we did think is if people want to ask a question and they actually want to ask it, then in the chat box, if you can just put question and send that message, then I'll pick that up and I'll bring you in to ask a question at the end. If you don't want to do that, then more than happy for you to type a question and I'll read them out a little bit later when we come to the Q&A session.
So I guess it's time to pull back the metaphorical curtain and see what's in store today, Richard.
Excellent. Okay, right. So hopefully. So today we just want to start talking about start by thinking about what we are going to cover. Laura's then going to give a brief presentation, about 15 minutes. I've got some slides on the end to cover off some themes around funding, and then, like I say, we've left plenty of time to go into a Q&A at the end. So just in terms of framing today's conversation, a couple of weeks ago there was some news from Rolls-Royce that they were cutting around 9,000 jobs. They were really, in my mind, the first sort of huge employer that had decided that they were going to make redundancies, and that really did, in my mind, sort of make me sit back and think, actually, redundancies are on the way, and people need to be prepared to have a look at what that means. And then, like I said, we had the flexible furlough. So this was announced by Rishi Sunak last Friday, and it's sort of like the next extension from July as to how the furlough scheme is going to work, increasing the reliance on employers to start paying some of those liabilities, and we'll cover that off in a bit. And then, from a funding point of view, we've all heard the stories about how the bounce back loans are absolutely flying out of the door, sort of 24-hour turnaround. But there's a lot of concern, and I've certainly raised this in our team meeting, around how some of these bounce back loans are actually going to be paid back. And the FT ran a story yesterday, I think it was, where they said that between 40 and 50% of those bounce back loans, might not be repayable or might not be repaid. And are the banks actually going to start chasing family-run small businesses for them? So in coming up with today's conversation, that's really what we focused on. Laura, over to you. Oh, I think you're on mute.
I have a habit of doing that to myself. So in light of the furlough update announced last Friday, there are a few different things that we need to talk about today. So I'm going to give you a bit of an update, and then also some things to consider as business owners, things that you might want to be thinking about, because I know there's a lot of speculation online, a lot of debates around what can and can't be done. And I think Martin Lewis has also waded into the debate. We're going to cover off about redundancies, just some basics, but some considerations that aren't commonly known about that you may want to think about. Question that we commonly get asked about holiday leave, so we'll be giving you a full overview of that, and also changes to contracts which may be inevitable to actually save jobs once the furlough scheme comes to an end. And I think Rich is going to cover off time to pay and funding, which some people have actually been utilising. Okay, so next slide, please. So furlough scheme, originally there was the cut-off for people to be on the furlough scheme on the 28th of February. That was the cut-off point. And then I think after some pretty powerful lobbying, that was extended to the 19th of March, as long as there was an RTI in place, which I'm sure you're all aware of. So the reasoning behind that was that you'd have to be psychic to have known to put somebody on the scheme by that date. It is a US term. It was never ever known about in the UK before. And actually, it's not as generous in the US because it is an unpaid leave. A few companies have utilised that before. And it does mean leave of absence. It originated in the 1600s, for those of you that like geeky facts. There was so many changes to the scheme. It was really difficult to keep up to date with, and it was really hard for us to advise clients early on, because there were 8 iterations. That is correct. There was definitely 8 of them. since it was first launched, which made it very, very difficult for us to be able to interpret that guidance and then give you all answers to things you wanted to know. It's now been extended for the very last time, so the Chancellor has announced that by October it will end, but this will be the third time that it's been extended. The reason it was extended the first time is because originally there was collective consultation to think about, and actually as fast as people had been put on the scheme, there was a possibility that they'd already have to start going into consultation with these employees if the scheme was to end at the end of May. So that was the rationale behind extending it. There will be a tapering effect, so the 80% will continue, that's funded by HMRC and the government, and that will continue through to July and August, and then it will be 70% in September and 60% in October. Now, what employers can't do, which is something that have been asked, is can we taper it in line with those amounts? E.g., in September we can say to somebody, well, the furlough's now gone down to 70%, therefore that's all we're going to pay you when you're on furlough. The rules are, although they're limited with what we know at the minute, they are quite clear in that it has to be the employer that tops it up to the 80%. And the last call, so the 10th of June is the last date for putting somebody onto furlough for the very last time in this scheme, because the scheme ends on the 30th of June. The Treasury Directive sitting behind it terminates on the 30th of June, and it will then be the new flexible furlough scheme that ends, that begins at the beginning of July. So next slide, please, Richard. In terms of considerations, there is a gradual, if you like, unfreezing programme that's happening now, and that is in line with the government and what they're trying to do to get the economy going again. So originally it was designed to complement the government's plans to keep the economy going. It was to protect the NHS, which was some of the thought behind having people at home for 3 weeks at a time, because if there was any self-isolation in the family or anything like that, people would be at home and able to stay there for 3 weeks at a time, which was again helping to protect the NHS. And now what the government are trying to do is unfreeze this situation where people have potentially been furloughed for quite a long period of time. And that process of unfreezing will start with that tapering to stop people being on the 80% paid for by the government and start to reboot the economy. The tapering of payments does coincide with the opening of schools, because I know a lot of people are at home and having to provide childcare at the minute, which can be problematic, especially if you're trying to work from home, or if you've got employees that may need to return to the office. It can be problematic with them having childcare responsibilities. And shops and everything else are able to open from the 15th of June, so that will be the non-essential shops. Essential services have always been there. And I know that they've had their own set of challenges bringing people back off furlough if they have gone onto it, which some people have. It depends on the situation. There are a number of reasons why furlough can be utilised, but it was anticipated that it would only be very, very essential situations where there is public funding involved. It's anticipated that hospitality will be woken up in July, which is much to the delight of a lot of people that I know. The reality is, though, that many of them will have a pretty quiet order book for at least July. As we're going to August, you've got to be thinking about the economy, the mood of people, whether they'll want to come in and, you know, into an indoor space. So these are all considerations which will impact the workforce, because you'll be thinking then about how many people you'll need to service those customers, etc. So although things are open, the reason that the flexible furlough scheme is by nature flexible is because the government recognise that you won't suddenly go from 0 to 60 overnight. And there will be some industries which are very heavily affected, particularly those with seasonal work, the education sector. You know, seaside resorts are really struggling at the minute, and holidays, as well as those that have got more of a social feel about them. So you've got the pubs and the restaurants and cinemas and places like that. Stage furlough is going to help to ease that burden, but there will need to be an element of employers putting their hands in their pockets as furlough continues. And if your order book is looking pretty poor for the remainder of the summer season, for example, it may be that it's still a better option to keep those employees furloughed and potentially stump up the rest of the money yourself, even if it is a small amount, if you want to retain those skills. The long-term implications are that redundancies may be unavoidable. It is a very sad fact that some people will not have a job at the end of all of this. And I think as employers, we've got to do our very best to make sure that people have the right support through the process, that they're given, you know, help to maybe write their CVs and help in how to interview, and you can then signpost them to places they can find this information, because it will be a very unsettling time for them, and there is still that overriding duty of care. You know, at the end of the day, you also need to be thinking about things like holidays that are accruing. You'll need to be thinking about whether people are approaching 2 years of service. Yes, it might sound pretty cold, you know, that you don't want someone to reach the 2 years of service, but actually when you're thinking about the finances behind that, do you have the money to make a statutory redundancy payment on top of everything else? And if it's to protect your business, it's something that you'll want to be thinking about. So costing exercises are essential. What can you afford? When can you afford to make payments to people? If they were to make a claim for something that you've done, what might that claim look like? And more importantly, when will things pick up? So what do you sort of project the future might look like? And then just a little side note on that, in terms of TUPE, if you have acquired businesses or you have sort of moved one company to another and you've consolidated things and people have TUPE transferred, then potentially they may have enhanced redundancy rights in their contracts. So you'll need to be aware of that, and we can help you with it. So in terms of redundancies, as I say, it is something that people will need to think about. There is a legal duty to collectively consult if you are planning to make redundant or dismiss from business 20 or more people within a 90-day period. Now, a lot of people think this commonly applies just to redundancy. So, you know, situation, the job's not there, sorry, thank you, here's the money, and that's the end of it. However, it does also apply if you are planning to dismiss and re-engage people. And this is quite common when you have a change of terms and conditions, where you will change from, you know, a certain pay rate, maybe you've got to cut some costs and you'll go into consultation. If you are dismissing them with a view to rehiring them, doesn't matter what the reason is, if you're dismissing them and it's not because of anything they've done, there is a duty to collectively consult. Failure to do that is a criminal offence by not notifying the Secretary of State, because obviously the government want to know what's coming up on the horizon as well. And it is an unlimited fine for not doing that. So if you are proposing to change things for 20 or more people, which may result in ending their contracts, you should definitely take some advice. It does apply per establishment. There's been a number of cases over the years about this, but Woolworths is one, when Woolworths unfortunately went under some years ago now. So for example, it would be a physical shop maybe closing, and therefore the people there may be made redundant because the other shop that's opening might be 50 miles away. It is slightly harder in practice when you've got people working virtually, because by definition there isn't really a set place of work. And in this situation, we would look at the factors around what type of work they do and things like that. So can be quite hard with virtual working, but ultimately it would come down to where their normal place of work is. So examples of compelling reasons to change terms and conditions. There is the need to make people redundant if the work has ceased or is going to cease to exist, or diminishes to the point where you just don't need as many people. And what we call these in legal speak is an ETO reason. And that stands for economical, technological, or organisational reason. So an example of a technological reason might be in a factory, if you've got 10 people working on a production line and then you bring some piece of tech kit in that can actually replace 5 people, what you only need then is 5 people in the role, and that is a classic redundancy situation. You do have to act reasonably, even if you've got a clause in the contracts with your employees that says I can change your hours with a month's notice. What the courts will always expect you to do is to act reasonably in demonstrating that clause. And the reason for that is that inherently there is an imbalance of power within employment contracts, and employers typically have the majority of the power, and courts are sensitive to this, and they accept that employees will need sometimes that balance of power redistributing, and therefore they'll expect you to demonstrate that you've been reasonable if you are looking to change somebody's hours, for example, you'd need to give them a sufficient amount of time. You'd need to make sure that if they've got any concerns or anything that will affect them at home, that you've given them sufficient time to get things in place. It is worth looking at the relevant pools as well for people that you would potentially look to make redundant. It might be that actually there's other people within the business that do a similar type of work, and these would also need to be pooled. So courts don't generally tend to get too involved in where the pools come from, but if people are doing work of a similar kind, then they should go into your pool, even if they are potentially safe, and that's part of a restructure. In order to select people, once you've identified your pool, you need to be looking at some selection criteria, and there are a few options around this. It's more popular in recent years that people tend to have a recruitment exercise. So for example, there was 10 jobs and now there's 6 newly created jobs, and therefore we'll have a competitive recruitment process. Or there is still the method of actually scoring people against a selection matrix, which you would share with them and explain to them as part of the consultation. But you need to be looking at some objective criteria to do that. So as I always say, it's not personal. It can't be personal. And then there is some misinformation out there, I think, at the minute about whether notice can be taken on furlough. This is quite a difficult area to interpret because actually there's nothing that says you can't serve notice to somebody while they're on furlough leave. The scheme is there to actually help employers that have been affected by COVID, but also the scheme itself doesn't say that you can't allow them to take notice on furlough, and it does recognise the fact that redundancies will need to be made. The guidance itself refers to redundancies. So what you would be expected to do there is explore that as a last resort. E.g., if there's a furlough scheme available and as an employer the 80% is agreed and it's not going to cost you anything, then a tribunal might not look very favourably, considering that imbalance of power, on an employer who is very quick to dismiss somebody for redundancy if there is an alternative to redundancy, and that is what employers are expected to explore. So just moving into holiday leave, this is one of the questions we probably get asked from our clients the most, and that is about holiday leave. And in particular, what's happening about people that are accruing leave and they may have heard people can carry leave forward. Well, potential issues here are twofold, because you've potentially got a pot of people that have not been furloughed, that have worked through and they've been unable to take a proper holiday to rest. Some have been working slightly harder than before, and they've been accruing leave. And then you've got a pool of people potentially who have been furloughed and they've been on furlough leave and not taking holiday, but still accruing it. And a return to the office could mean a them and an us situation. And that's going to be quite a difficult employee relations issue to manage. So what I'd suggest employers do very early on is start thinking about the management of holidays. It's quite a common misconception that employees can take holiday when they want. It's not true. Employers have a duty to give employees the statutory minimum holiday allowance, and that's a right that's enshrined in law. However, employees can request to take holiday when it suits them, but employers, under the working time regulations, do have the right to tell employees when to take that holiday. And we've helped with situations where notice has been served to take holiday, and people have said, well, I don't want to take it, and it's very much well, I'm sorry that you feel like that. These are the reasons why we're asking you to do it. What are your objections to doing it? Seeing if you can find some parity with them. But if you can't, ultimately you can push ahead as an employer. Now, it's something worth thinking about before it becomes a problem, and as I say, you can serve notice on them. But there are a few options for this. So in terms of giving you some practical advice, either you can go very, very sort of forcefully with it and say, look, you need to take holiday by the end of June. I'm telling you that these dates are what you need to take, and I'm going to give you the requisite amount of notice. Or you can suggest that they take holiday. So you could say to them, look, I want you to take or choose a week to take between now and this date, but I'll leave it to you to choose that date. Or you could, if they can't take it and you just don't think it's possible, then there is now the statutory right for it to be carried over the next 2 holiday years. this only applies to the first 4 weeks of the Working Time Directive holiday. Holiday is split into two portions. There's the Working Time Directive, which is governed by Europe and European law, which is here to stay, regardless of Brexit. That will stick for 4 weeks, and that's the proportion they can carry forward. And then there is the Working Time Regulation proportion of holiday, which covers the UK bank holidays, and that's the 1.6 weeks. So what I'm referring to is the 4 weeks of Working Time Directive holiday. And it's only if operations have been affected by COVID. So if you are in an industry that's continued to operate throughout, and you've not allowed people to take holiday because you've also been very busy, that would be the reason that somebody could take holiday, because there's just been no opportunity. But I think being reasonable, if somebody doesn't have a lot of work to do, there will be no reason why you couldn't serve notice onto them, but get everything in writing. It's always worth documenting what's happened. But just be realistic, paint an honest picture with people, let them know the position that you're in. If it's the difference between taking holiday and potentially being made redundant, I know which option the majority of people would choose if it was spelt out to them that way. And there's nothing wrong with being honest with employees. It's something that you should be doing. So just moving on now to changes in contracts. So as I said earlier, collective consultation still applies. You need to have a compelling case to do it, so you can't act capriciously. It can't be out of spite. It can't be, well, actually, I just don't really like this person. We've had a few performance issues. I'm going to make it impossible for them to work to their contract, and now's a good opportunity. It's absolutely a good time to reset. It's a really good time to restart things for employers and have a think about those things. But there does still need to be a compelling case behind it, and that's something which may get overlooked. And I'd recommend that you document your business case for it and have a sound reason for pressing ahead, and basically saying, my reason for changing these contracts or needing to change them outweighs your reasons for maybe not being able to work what I'm asking you to do. Something that I mentioned about the furlough scheme and it being a suitable alternative is that it must be a suitable alternative, and they must be explored. So if there is another role elsewhere in the business and that person probably could do it, you'd struggle to argue why that isn't a suitable alternative. It may still be a redundancy situation. So there is sometimes restructures where roles are, proposed to get rid of certain roles and actually create new roles, but less of them with more skills. That may still be a redundancy situation. So a restructure doesn't necessarily mean there won't be a redundancy. But keep very good notes of what's said. Try and get employees to sign the notes just so that you're all on the same page. It's an awful lot easier to do that in a meeting with the employee rather than trying to ask them down the line once there starts to be some issues. And there are some possible options if the employee doesn't agree. So one possible option might be to, if you feel that your case is that compelling and there isn't going to be that much of a detriment to them, you might press ahead with it and you might say, well, we're going to do it anyway. There is a risk of constructive dismissal if you do that, but it might be that you think the risk is worth it. There may also be a situation where you offer to rehire them. So you say, well, look, actually, we're going to have to do this. We'll dismiss you and rehire you on the new terms that we're proposing. Or you could just back down and say, well, okay, it's not that important from what you've said, and we're not going to make any changes. So there are a few options, but none of them are to be approached without caution. And I'm sorry to say that none of them are risk-free. The best option is always to get agreement. But I do think, sort of as a professional opinion, tribunals will be quite sympathetic to the plight of employers, but they will be expecting employers to demonstrate reasonableness, and the sympathy won't extend to actually skipping stages of a formal process. So what's next? Well, tribunals are always going to be there. There is always the risk of them, but having the right advice and support in place will allow you to certainly minimise those risks. And if somebody does try to litigate with you, you've got a very good defence. I think we'll see quite a lot of the typical claims. Typically what we see is, claims for unlawful deduction of wages, claims around holiday pay, usually some unfair dismissal cases, and that will probably continue. But the warning areas, I think, for employers, and what I expect to see more of, are allegations of whistleblowing, potentially around people being asked to work when they're on furlough, health and safety detriment, so people sharing concerns they've got and them not being taken seriously, potentially discrimination and unfair dismissal. And something which mustn't be underestimated is how desperate people can be when they're losing their job. You know, looking at the economy out there, it doesn't exactly look picturesque for the next, 2 to 3 years and maybe longer. So in these kinds of desperate situations, employees will be wanting to make sure that they are protected in every way possible. So it is important that you scrutinise yourself and check yourself at each stage of the process. There will be people with caring responsibilities, as I mentioned earlier about schools. People won't be able to send their children to school, and this may impact their productivity and their ability to actually work. And there will be sensitive discussions to be had around that. Mental health at work, there may be people that are so afraid of going out that they might not be able to come to work. Some will relish the chance to return, and others might be terrified. It will be individual for different people, but they will require, again, very sensitive and careful management, exploring all the options available before any decisions are taken. Sort of act in haste and repent at leisure. Make sure that you are looking at every single angle and really understanding that employee's concerns. This may be the start of a rocky road to come for employers. I certainly think it will get worse before it gets better, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I like to think of myself as a pragmatist, and I do think that things may get worse out there in terms of litigation and disputes. But the good news is that if you do keep really good material evidence notes, that is the best thing you can do, because you're the whole way through demonstrating what you've done and how you've tried to demonstrate your duty of care. Keep employees, communicated with. Even if they're on furlough, you can still communicate, and I would implore you to communicate with them while they're on furlough if it's something as serious as this that will affect them. And sometimes you will have to weigh up a risk versus a reward. So if you really think that you need to make redundancies and you've got to take some of these very difficult decisions, there will be the chance that that is just what you've got to do. And if the risk is a tribunal claim and it's potentially worth this amount of money, but you think potentially the employee is quite low risk and you've generally got a good relationship with them, it might be something that commercially you decide to go ahead with. But the key is to get some good advice behind it, just so you know what your liabilities are. So they are my predictions. As much as I said I don't have a crystal ball, I look forward to seeing how many of them I was right about in the future. So I'm just going to pass over to you now, Richard, to cover off some funding.
Hey, thanks, Laura. And you do owe me a fine now because you used the word Brexit.
Sorry.
Which we said we wouldn't. So, yeah, no, thanks for that. I'm really interested, and actually, some questions are starting to appear, which we can cover off in a minute. I just want to spend a little bit of time just talking about funding. Very much the sideshow to Laura today, because obviously a lot of people are very concerned about the employment side of furlough job retention scheme. But we did call it furlough funding, so I thought I should just have a few words about where we are with funding. The bounce back loans, they are, as I said at the start, really flying out of the door. So I spoke to somebody who applied yesterday, and they have the money in their account today. A couple of weeks ago, spoke to one client who was saying that they hadn't received the money, and I sort of said, "Are you sure?" We logged into Xero, had a look at their bank feed, and actually the amount, the money was there. So the banks have got the systems right, and certainly the honour to turn those around quickly seems to be happening. It's really important to use them for the right reason. So, we've talked to some people who have said, well, actually, that's fine because I can use it to support my wages, or I can do this, or I can do that personal payments wise. And you can't do that. It is for business purposes. So it's important to get them and use them for the right reasons. And I think, just going back to that FT article, they are repayable. I think this is something that I've really sort of tried to caution our team about, that they're so easy to get. They're almost like a grant, and people feel that they are like a grant because they're so easy to get. There's no hoops to jump through other than the 24 odd questions you have to answer when you apply for it, and put in some information about the business. But they are going to be repayable, and for those smaller businesses where maybe cash is a little bit tighter, you've got to bear in mind what those repayments might be. Interest is small, but there is still going to be some sort of capital repayment at some point. In terms of the CBILS, so the bounce back's larger brother, that picture is definitely mixed. AAA SMEs really well supported by the banks and being actively encouraged to apply for loans, reasonably quick turnarounds on that, and some really good rates. Good businesses in the more sort of like SME bracket, so the sort of the smaller end of that bracket, having to jump through a lot of hoops with the banks and seen delays, and in one case a 4-week long no. So it took the bank 4 weeks to evaluate the application and then turn them down, which is really bad news for the business owner, because if they're banking on that money, then you need a fast decision. So yeah, definitely a mixed picture. We've started to look at Funding Circle as an alternative. They are a CBILS approved lender, and they're offering a no capital, no interest payment for 12 months deal. The rates are a little bit higher, but not Funding Circle ridiculously high that you sometimes see and hear about. But they do offer a bit of a comfort blanket for those businesses that think that within 12 months they will have enough money to repay that back. Obviously there's a huge amount of careful planning to do before you sort of make those decisions, but Funding Circle is something that we are actively talking to clients about. And in terms of turnaround, we made an application last Wednesday, and we got the answer back by Friday with the approval. So again, Funding Circle, they're a fintech. They understand about fast turnaround, and they've got the systems to back it up. So they're another good option. It is all about cash flow, though. It's all about thinking about how the shape of the V curve might be for your business and what that might look like. And I did this graph a few weeks ago now, just to try and illustrate what I mean by this. And if you imagine that the red line is your normal cash prediction of how you might come out of the lockdown and out of the situation, the blue line represents thinking of things now that you can do to start generating some income. So I know we've talked to some hotels and some pubs, and they've actually been sort of selling takeaways, thinking about how they can offer services that are around what they normally do, just to start generating some income, and that would be represented by the blue line. And then the green line sort of doesn't think about things that you can do sort of right here and right now, but actually starts to think about when you can start to unlock things and open up again. What can you do to make a big bang really, really early on, and accelerate that level of cash flow in those early days before maybe it tapers off. So certainly having to think about how you can sort of start generating some income now and then accelerate the cash flow when it comes in when you start is something that I would be thinking about. In terms of time to pay, this is the HMRC scheme to allow you to arrange to pay certain liabilities, corporation tax and pay-as-you-earn, particularly over a period of time. Most businesses that we worked with deferred all pay-as-you-earn liabilities until the 20th of June. So they are starting to now think about making applications to HMRC for a payment profile or some sort of arrangement. My view is that HMRC will be sympathetic to a further deferment to the 20th of July. It needs to be approved by them, need to make a call, but my view is if you do definitely need it, then you should pick up the phone and ask, and they will probably be sympathetic. The furlough grant is causing quite a lot of confusion and in some cases anger, I guess, out there, because HMRC's take on it is that if you receive a job retention scheme grant that covers both the net pay for the employee plus the national insurance and pay-as-you-earn contributions, then you should be paying that back to them. I had quite a long conversation with somebody at their call centre about this, and when asked where was that in the original legislation, they couldn't point to it, but it does seem to be a recent policy decision that they have taken. I guess the practical sort of side of this is that they don't have the scope currently to start pursuing any debt or resources to collect it actively. And if we're going back to them with proposals to make repayments by the 20th of June, then it's a bit academic, I suppose. But if you are going to make the call, just expect them to have a conversation with you about that. We don't think that HMRC have actually had any direction from the Treasury yet about what to accept with a time to pay arrangement. Typically when these have been used in the past, the arrangements have been over 12 months repayment. I don't know. I think that they might go a bit further this time. Unprecedented times, and I think they may stretch that maybe 18, 24 months. We've got some, and I know other accountancy firms that we're in the same network of have got some time to pay arrangements sort of stored up to go in, and it'll be interesting to see what we manage to get when they start going in. Ensure that the case that you put forward is backed up by cash flows, evidence and facts. HMRC have always been more likely to accept a proposal if it's backed up by cash flow. So again, it comes back to having a good set of forecasts that you can fall back on. And when I was on the call with them a week ago, they did say that anything under 100,000 should go through the debt management unit by the phone, but anything above 100,000, you would need to actually physically post the application to them. And interestingly, we got a letter back from them yesterday on another case where we were just deferring the payments and just confirming that. And there was no telephone number or email address on the letter. So anything under 100,000, call the debt management unit, and anything above 100,000 post to them. If anybody does want the address, I've got that, and I can let you have it. So that was me sort of covering funding, and I just wanted to end by really picking up something that Laura said earlier on, that if you are looking at redundancies, one of the issues that you could have is actually paying for them and making those redundancy payments, and how that's going to work with your cash flow. And in my mind, that's one of the big ticks of the business interruption loan scheme. The CBILS scheme's there to support businesses who've got cash flow problems at this time. So any restructuring costs, redundancy costs, spikes in working capital because debtors aren't paying, or you aren't able to bill, any sort of costs you're incurring relating to extra PPE or extra things you've got to put in terms of screens around desks and those sorts of things, it would cover that. Like I said, redundancy and extra assets. So don't be afraid of thinking that CBILS and the bounce back loan can be used for those sorts of things, because it certainly can. So that's I suppose the presentation side of it. Hope you've found that useful. There are some questions that have come in. So Laura, is it okay if I just kick off with some of the questions?
Yep, go for it.
So first one from Teresa, and actually this is followed up by a few other people afterwards, is around directors and whether directors are now allowed to be included on furlough, and what they can do within their businesses. So I can cover that bit off, but if you can just talk around sort of directors and whether they can be furloughed.
Yeah, so it wasn't clear at first when the scheme was launched whether or not directors were included. In fact, I think the first iteration of the guidance had about 8 paragraphs with how you should run such a complex scheme. But it is clear now that directors can be furloughed and can be included. What isn't yet clear is that how that will work with the flexible furlough scheme. Now, the guidance for that is not going to be published until the 12th of June. And what we don't yet know is how that will interact and whether or not directors will be given any more flexibility than the current restrictions, which are, well, at first they were statutory duties only, and then they were extended in the latest draft of updated guidance long after people had taken decisions. And that then said that it could extend to undertaking things such as administering payroll and applying for furlough. So it looks like there has been a bit of a loosening around the rules from HMRC's point of view as to what directors can do, but they will still be able to be part of the flexible furlough scheme, whether or not it means that the nature of the flexible furlough scheme itself, by allowing people to be furloughed for a week at a time, which is a feature of the new scheme versus the old scheme, which was 3 weeks. It's a week at a time and people can partially work. So as an example, I'm giving one that Rishi gave when he did the initial speech about it. You may have a director that only has 1 or 2 days worth of work to do. And in that situation, they could work and be paid normally for that work. And then they could be furloughed for the other 3 days of that week. So it isn't yet clear what actual duties directors will be allowed to do. But I think with that scheme, it's a bit of a happy medium, really, because directors will be able to work enough and sufficiently enough to be able to do what they need to do as a normal employee, director employee of the business, and still potentially take advantage of the furlough scheme for the remaining days when there perhaps isn't enough to do.
Okay, thanks. And I suppose a follow-up to that question from Sean. If a director hasn't furloughed themselves to date, would they need to furlough themselves for the last 3 weeks of June to qualify?
Yes. So there's a couple of things that are quite clear from the scheme, even though, as I say, the guidance isn't yet out till the 12th of June, the devil's in the detail. For anybody that wants to be considered on the flexible furlough scheme, which starts on the 1st of July, must have had a furlough claim submitted for them on the old scheme. And as the furlough claim has to be for a minimum period of 3 weeks, the latest date that somebody can go on to furlough within this scheme that currently operates is the 10th of June, including the 10th of June. So that is 21 days if you include the 30th of June. And that's the only way that people will be able to then use the flexible furlough scheme, which will be closed to new people. And then you'll be able to have that flexibility. There is just a little watch out on that, in that you'll not be able to make a claim for any more people under the flexible furlough scheme than you have done before on the current scheme. And what I mean by that is, if you've made a claim for, say, 25 people in April, and then a different 15 people in May, and then a different 10 people in June, and that's your total workforce, and your plan is to rotate them all in July, you actually can't claim for more than 25 as part of that claim, because that's the maximum number that you've claimed for in a month on the old furlough scheme. So it is worth bearing that in mind with flexibility. As I've said before, make early plans, have a look at what your workforce needs are, and you probably will have to do it in quite a lot of detail, but it will be worth it to make sure that you can take advantage of the scheme in its new form.
Okay, thanks. I think a question from Amber we've covered off already around holiday pay and whether employees still accrue holiday pay. I think I'm right in saying that they do accrue whilst they're on furlough.
They do.
So moving a little bit further down, question from Steve: can furloughed employees still attend training and development sessions if it's voluntary?
Yes, they can. They can still participate, and it is encouraged that people do to keep their skills up to date. However, they can't participate in any training that will generate revenue for the employer. And in practice, what that means is, if you have an apprentice doing an apprenticeship scheme, you'd have to be very careful that you weren't asking them to do so much work that what you're asking them to do outweighs the furlough payment. So the development and keeping things going is very important, but just don't overload the apprentices is what I would suggest, and make sure that they're still getting paid at least minimum wage for the hours that they have been training.
Okay, great, thank you. And a couple of questions from Chris. As part of a redundancy process, can you offer affected staff priority should you need further down the road to re-recruit or bring freelance staff in?
Yeah, there's nothing to say that you can't do that. I mean, once a redundancy process has been started and effected and somebody has been dismissed by way of redundancy, that then terminates the relationship. So assuming there is no appeal, or if there was an appeal that it wasn't upheld, then that would terminate the employment relationship. What you do thereafter is down to the agreement between you and the individual, but what you would want to be careful around, I think, is setting some parameters around that. So you might be able to make that commitment for a month or two, although arguably be careful, because you could say that, is it really a redundancy if it was just going to be that short a period of time? But if you sort of said, in the next 3 months, I'll make a commitment that if there's anything that comes up, I'll prioritise you. Just make sure the expectations are clear, and make sure that what you agree with them, again, put it in writing, and don't create any false hope or false expectations. Just be upfront with people. You'd want to probably go into the detail around what job that might be, and if it was a similar role, for example, you wouldn't want to recruit somebody as sort of a senior manager that was perhaps an operative on the shop floor, and that wouldn't be possible. So just be practical, but just make some very simple notes.
Okay, fine. And Chris, from me, are bounce back loans available to charities? I believe they are. Certainly CBILS loans are available, so I wouldn't see any reason why bounce back loans weren't. I will double check that though, and I'll come back to everybody. when I have checked that. We've got some questions that were sent in before. So all three of my staff are on furlough now. We're planning to go back on the 22nd of June, but for only 3 days a week, with 2 staff coming back and 1 staying on furlough. Can the 2 staff coming back on the 22nd of June go back on to flexible furlough from the 1st of July?
The guidance hasn't yet been published, so we can't say for certain, but my gut feeling on this is that won't be possible to do under the current scheme, because the scheme, as we know, it ends on the 30th of June. And in order to make a claim on the government portal, there needs to be a minimum 3-week period under the current scheme to apply for furlough. And that's exactly why the cut-off date is the 10th of June, to allow that 3-week period to elapse. So actually, what I think you'd have to do is treat them as separate claims, and therefore the first claim would fail because you haven't allowed the 3-week period of time. If you are thinking of bringing anybody back in between the 10th of June and the end of June, it is something to be aware of as an employer, and we'll keep you updated through our FAQs. But it may be that then you can't put a furlough claim in for the 2 weeks or 1 week, the remainder of June, because it is just too short a period. So it is worth thinking about when you plan for staff.
And then another question from Teresa around directors and the timing of directors. So due to the changes with furlough coming in from 1st July, we're a limited company and have kept 1 director off furlough so that they can still generate income. If that director goes on to furlough by the 10th of June and the other director comes back off, can we both then claim after the 1st of July if necessary? Yes,
you can. You could then potentially both go on to the flexible furlough scheme, and you could maybe split your week. So one of you does maybe 2 days and the other does 3 days, or however you want to work it to make sure that you've got that continuity.
Okay. And then a couple of questions from David. Looking to bring back a member of the finance team on a part-time furlough arrangement, but know that they have childcare issues and not happy sending her daughter back to school. How will this work for me? She's the best person to do the job.
Well, potentially what I'd be looking at is whether or not she could work from home. So even if somebody has got childcare responsibilities, a lot of employers are sympathetic with the plight faced by people at the minute. We're all in very unusual circumstances. There isn't a lot of schooling support available. I know some schools are better than others. That's not a slight on schools in the slightest, no pun intended. But what I would say is that try to be as flexible as you can. It might be that you could bring that employee back and agree some temporary hours with them, you know, to work more flexibly into the evening perhaps. You know, look at all the other options before going to the extreme and saying that you can't accommodate it. However, if you do need them back in the office and those things just aren't an option, it is a bit of a dilemma, but you could potentially look at allowing them to take some annual leave or some unpaid leave. You have to be careful that you're not putting a practice in place that's going to discriminate against, you know, more people of one protected characteristic, like women who generally tend to have the bulk of childcare responsibilities. You just need to be careful that what you're asking is sensible and proportionate. But you might say, look, you know, in light of this, I'm happy to extend your furlough, or allow you to work from home, or allow you to take some unpaid leave, or allow you to take some parental leave. There's lots of different types of family-friendly leave that are available to employers depending on the situation. But again, it's not putting people at a disadvantage just because they are parents or with a protected characteristic. So tricky one. There isn't really an easy answer to that question, but I think that's probably as much as I can say.
Okay, fine, thank you. Another question from David about redundancy, and this is a question that I've been asked a few times and talked to some people about. I need to make a couple of my employees redundant, as I don't think the work will pick up for them as quickly as I would like. I think I want to address these issues now, but should I wait until the end of the furlough period, or at least August until starting?
There's great debate in the legal arena about this, and as I mentioned and alluded to in the presentation, an employer must look at all suitable alternatives before taking the decision to end somebody's employment. Now, if the order book, you know, if you could potentially extend someone's furlough until the end of August, and then the order book looks pretty healthy for September, and you were to go ahead and make somebody redundant now, there is potentially an argument that that could be seen as unfair, because there was an alternative, and that alternative was to leave them on furlough. It wasn't really going to cost you anything other than a bit of holiday accrual. You know, surely that will be better than actually making somebody redundant and having to pay them redundancy pay. So you have to look at what you're doing and whether it's proportionate. But if you work in an industry where the summer season is make or break for you, and that's the be all and end all, and you know your whole year is completely destroyed by this pandemic, and it may be the same next year, then there's almost an argument to say don't delay the inevitable and actually look after the business and, you know, the money that you do have. And at that point, I don't see how any tribunal would find a dismissal in that situation unfair.
Okay, one last final question, another one from David. One of my really good employees is running up to retirement, currently on furlough. The intention was that he could retire in July. I'd be happy to pay the amount needed under the furlough arrangement and allow him to retire in October. Is that acceptable? A
retirement is effectively a resignation. There's no such thing as a statutory retirement age anymore. So retirement is personal to each employee. If the option was there to take furlough and effectively stay employed for longer, then I don't see why an employee wouldn't want to do that. But it would be a discussion to have with the employee, because once they've handed in their notice and resigned and you've accepted it, you've agreed to terminate the contract. So you would have to propose it to them and see what they thought about it. But there's no pressure on them to do so if they decide that they want to retire when they originally planned.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, I think that covers off all of the questions. Thanks everybody for
sorry, Richard, just one quick one. I think Sean's just posted I think he just posted and then he cut off his question in the chat box. So it's okay, I'll just take this last one just to kind of finish it. But I think Sean's mentioned about working to date full time, wanting to furlough as a director under the flexible furlough scheme. Sean, you would have to furlough yourself and not work for 3 weeks by no later than the 10th of June to be able to qualify for flexible furlough. So if you miss that boat and you don't do it by then, and as you've said, you haven't made any claim in the furlough scheme so far, you will not be able to take advantage of flexible furlough going forward.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I think, you know, for directors, and you know, this is quite confusing. So if anybody has got any specific questions, then, you know, just get in touch with us after today, and we'll come back to you. So yeah, thanks for contributing to the Q&A, everybody. I just want to wrap up with some final thoughts, really. Please let us have some feedback on today. This was new for Laura and I. We came up with a concept a couple of months ago. Thought it would be a good idea to see how HR and finance collide in a sort of a presentation style. We've had to do it virtually instead of sort of physically. So yeah, please let us have some feedback on that. We'll do a wrap up of today's session on LinkedIn. So if you're on LinkedIn, please have a look at that, have a look at the blog post, and if you've enjoyed it, share, and hopefully next time have a few more people on. We are going to invite guests from time to time to join us. As we said at the start, we're going to make decisions around what we talk about just before the next session, so that we make sure that we're talking about things that are topical and current and that, you know, people will be interested in. And you know, we've both got a really good network of contacts, so hopefully we'll bring relevant people in to talk from time to time. We've got some ideas about maybe having some leadership themed sessions in the future, because that's something that we're both talking to a lot of people about at the moment, so that would be good. Our next webinar is planned for the 2nd of July. I'm in trouble because that's my wedding anniversary, but I was supposed to be biking in the Wold, so doing this I think I can probably get away with. So I think, you know, thank you again for your time, and I think, as they say, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Laura. Yeah, thank you everybody. We'll see you next time.
Take care. Thank you. Bye bye everyone.